Ryan Summers had always thought his marriage to Sarah was solid. They'd been together for 12 years, and their son, Jake, was the heart of their small, suburban life in Ohio. Ryan worked in real estate, and Sarah ran her own freelance photography business. Their days were filled with routine, but Ryan never minded that. It was stability, and he believed in the life they had built. However, recently, something felt off. Sarah had begun acting differently. She started taking on more photography jobs, especially on weekends, and her laughter, once so infectious, now felt strained. Ryan noticed she was more distracted, often checking her phone with an anxious look and excusing herself to take calls privately. Ryan had tried to ignore it at first. She was busy, he told himself. The photography business had picked up, and maybe that explained her preoccupation. He didn't want to be the kind of husband who hovered or got paranoid over small things. But then, there were the late-night texts. The sudden weekend trips that didn't quite add up. What started as small suspicions grew into larger doubts. The worst part? Their son, Jake, seemed to be in the middle of it all. The once bubbly 13-year-old had become withdrawn. He was always glued to his phone, giving vague answers when Ryan asked about his mother's whereabouts. "Mom's at a client's house," or "she'll be back later" became standard responses, but the explanations never quite lined up. Ryan's got twisted every time he heard them, but he wasn't ready to dig too deep. He didn't want to believe his family was falling apart. One night, after Sarah had gone out again for a client shoot, Ryan found himself alone in the kitchen. He was going through the mail when a hotel receipt caught his eye. It wasn't for a regular hotel, but a high-end one, the kind they couldn't afford to splurge on casually. The receipt was for a night last weekend, during one of Sarah's supposed work trips. Ryan's heart raced as he scanned the details. The room was booked under her name, but there was another person listed, A. Johnson. Ryan didn't know anyone named A. Johnson. His mind spiraled. Could it be a client? A colleague? Or was it someone else entirely? He didn't confront Sarah right away. Instead, he stewed in silence, watching as his once trusted partner moved about the house like everything was fine. Jake, who had always been so open with Ryan, now seemed to avoid his father's gaze. The boy was always either locked in his room or out with friends, and Ryan had a gnawing feeling that his son knew more than he was letting on. A few days later, Ryan finally decided to ask Jake directly. It was late, and Sarah was out again. Ryan knocked on Jake's bedroom door and walked in, finding his son sitting on the bed, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, bud," Ryan began, trying to sound casual. "Have you noticed anything strange with your mom lately?" Jake didn't look up. "Nope," he replied quickly, too quickly. Ryan frowned. "Come on, Jake. You've been acting different too. Is there something you're not telling me?" For a moment, Jake hesitated. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then clamped it shut. "It's nothing, Dad. She's just busy." Ryan knew that wasn't the full story, but he didn't push. If Jake wasn't ready to talk, he wasn't going to force him. Still, the uneasy feeling in his stomach only deepened. Something was wrong. Something his own son was hiding. That night, after Sarah came home, Ryan watched her closely. She greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, the same way she always did, but there was a distance to it, a formality. He wanted to grab her, shake her, demand to know who A. Johnson was, but instead, he swallowed his questions and returned to his silent vigil, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. A few weeks passed, and the tension in the Summers household grew thicker. Sarah continued her weekend trips, always giving the same excuses about new clients and out-of-town shoots. Ryan's suspicions had only gotten worse, but it wasn't until one Saturday afternoon that his fears were fully realized. Ryan had come home early from work, hoping to surprise Sarah and maybe confront her about the hotel receipt. But when he walked through the door, it wasn't Sarah he found. It was Jake, sitting at the kitchen table, looking uneasy. "Where's your mom?" Ryan asked, setting down his keys. Jake hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "She's out at a shoot." Ryan narrowed his eyes. "Where exactly?" Jake bit his lip. "She didn't say. Just out of town for the day." Ryan's heart sank. The lie was obvious. His own son was covering for her. Ryan sat down across from Jake, trying to keep his voice calm. "Jake, I need you to be honest with me. Is there something going on with your mom that I should know about? Jake looked down at the table, refusing to meet his father's gaze. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Ryan pressed. I saw the hotel receipt, Jake. I know she's been lying about where she's going. And I think you know too. Jake's face paled. For a moment, Ryan thought the boy might break down and confess everything. But instead, Jake shook his head and muttered, It's nothing, Dad. She's just working. Ryan's frustration boiled over. Jake, I need the truth. Is she cheating on me? Jake's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and fear. No, Dad, he practically shouted. She's not. She's just working, okay? You have to trust her. But Ryan didn't trust her. Not anymore. And now, he wasn't sure if he could trust Jake either. Without another word, Ryan stood up and left the room, leaving his son sitting there, guilt written all over his face. He knew Jake was hiding something. The boy had never been a good liar, and now, his attempts at deception were painfully clear. Ryan spent the rest of the day pacing the house, trying to decide what to do next. Should he confront Sarah? Should he demand that Jake tell him the truth? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them leading to a good outcome. When Sarah returned later that evening, Ryan couldn't even look at her. She kissed his cheek and asked how his day had been, but he barely responded. Instead, he watched her with cold suspicion, waiting for her next move. That night, as Ryan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized something chilling. If his own son was lying to him, then the truth might be even worse than he'd imagined. Whatever Sarah was hiding, Jake was complicit, and that terrified him more than anything. Ryan barely slept that night, his mind racing with thoughts of Sarah, Jake, and the lie that now sat between them like an immovable wall. By morning, he had made up his mind. He needed answers, and he couldn't wait for them to come to him. Jake had been covering for Sarah, but he wasn't going to let his son carry that burden any longer. The next morning, over breakfast, Ryan could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Sarah sat across from him, sipping her coffee, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing inside his mind. Jake was quieter than usual, pushing his cereal around the bowl without taking a bite. Ryan set his mug down firmly, breaking the silence. Sarah, we need to talk. She glanced up, startled. About what? Ryan's eyes flicked toward Jake, who immediately stiffened. About what's really been going on. The hotel receipt. The trips. I want the truth. For a moment, Sarah looked like a deer caught in headlights, her face paling as she processed his words. Jake's eyes darted between his parents, anxiety radiating off him. I told you, Ryan, Sarah stammered. I've been working. That's all. Don't lie to me, Sarah, Ryan said, his voice harder than he intended. I found the hotel bill. You weren't alone. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly masked it with indignation. You went through my things? I found it by accident, Ryan shot back. But now I want an explanation. Who is A. Johnson? Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Sarah with pleading eyes. It was clear to Ryan that his son already knew the answer, and that hurt him more than anything. Sarah's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was cornered, and they both knew it. Ryan pressed on, unwilling to back down. I've been patient. I've given you space to tell me what's going on. But this has gone too far. I need to know the truth, Sarah. I deserve that much. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she looked down at her hands. It's not what you think, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ryan clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. Then what is it? Because right now, it looks like you've been cheating on me. Jake dropped his spoon, the loud clatter breaking the tension. Dad, stop it, he shouted, surprising both of his parents. Ryan turned to his son, his voice softening. Jake, if you know something, please tell me. You don't have to protect her anymore. But Jake's eyes filled with tears. It's not like that, he yelled, standing up so fast his chair tipped over. Mom's not cheating on you. Just leave her alone. Ryan stood there, stunned, as Jake stormed out of the kitchen and ran upstairs, slamming his bedroom door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Ryan turned back to Sarah, who was now wiping away tears. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "I can't live like this anymore." Sarah took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. "There's someone else, but it's not what you think." Ryan's heart stopped. The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sarah shook her head. "It's not like that, Ryan. I didn't mean for it to happen. It's just, he's someone I met during a shoot. His name is Alex. But nothing physical ever happened. We just talked." Ryan couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife had been emotionally involved with another man, and she had dragged their son into the middle of it. "You've been lying to me, to Jake, and now you're saying it wasn't physical? How am I supposed to believe that?" Sarah's face crumpled as she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Ryan. I didn't know how to stop it. It was like he understood me in a way I hadn't felt in so long, and I got caught up in it. But I swear, it wasn't about you. I never wanted to hurt you." Ryan's mind raced. He wanted to yell, to cry, to lash out, but the betrayal was too raw for him to process. His own son had been lying for her, protecting her secret while Ryan sat in the dark. "What about Jake?" Ryan demanded, his voice cracking. "Why did you make him lie for you?" Sarah looked up, guilt etched in her tear-streaked face. "I didn't mean for him to get involved. He found out by accident when I was texting Alex, and I panicked. I begged him not to tell you because I didn't want to destroy our family. I thought I could handle it on my own, but then it just got worse." Ryan was speechless. His wife had been carrying on an emotional affair, and his son had been complicit in covering it up. The weight of it all was too much to bear. For a long moment, Ryan said nothing, his mind swirling with anger and betrayal. Finally, he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to get out of here," he muttered, walking toward the front door. "Ryan, wait," Sarah called after him, but he was already gone, the door slamming behind him. As Ryan stepped out into the cool morning air, his mind was spinning. He didn't know where to go or what to do, but he couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by lies. He drove aimlessly for hours, replaying the events over and over in his head. His family had fallen apart right under his nose, and he hadn't even seen it coming. But more than anything, he couldn't shake the image of Jake, his son, caught between loyalty to his mother and the truth. How could Ryan ever trust either of them again? When he finally pulled over, he found himself parked in front of a small park where he used to take Jake when he was younger. The swings creaked in the wind, and the sight of them brought back memories of happier times. Times when his family hadn't been consumed by secrets and lies. Ryan leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as the weight of everything pressed down on him. His marriage was broken, his trust shattered, and worst of all, he didn't know if it could ever be repaired. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ryan knew one thing for sure. The truth had come out, but it had left scars that might never heal. Ryan didn't return home that night. Instead, he spent hours driving through the quiet streets of their small town, wrestling with the weight of Sarah's confession and the knowledge that his son had been drawn into the deception. He parked in a small lot by a lake just outside of town, the water reflecting the dim moonlight. Alone with his thoughts, he tried to figure out what his next move should be. Divorce? Separation? Confrontation? His emotions swung wildly between anger and sadness, betrayal and confusion. By the time Ryan returned home the next morning, he hadn't slept. The house was silent when he stepped inside. Jake had left for school, and Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into her coffee cup. She looked up when she heard him, her eyes red from crying. "Ryan," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond. He just walked past her and went straight upstairs, needing a shower and a moment to clear his head before he could face her again. As the hot water washed over him, Ryan thought about Jake. The boy had been protecting his mother, lying to his father, and carrying a secret far too heavy for a teenager. The betrayal hurt, but he couldn't bring himself to be angry with Jake. He was just a kid, caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. After he got dressed, Ryan found Sarah still sitting at the table, waiting for him. The awkwardness between them was palpable, as if they were strangers rather than partners who had built a life together. "We need to talk," she said quietly, gesturing to the seat across from her. Ryan sat down but didn't look at her. He couldn't. Every time he did, all he could think about was how she had lied, how she had let their son carry that burden. "Where's Jake?" he asked. "School," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "He left early. He feels awful, Ryan." Ryan nodded, knowing the guilt Jake must have been feeling. But he still wasn't ready to deal with that. "How did this happen, Sarah? I don't understand how we got here." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know. It just happened. I didn't plan for any of this. I never wanted to hurt you or Jake, but I felt so lost. Alex was there, and he made me feel understood. But it was a mistake." Ryan cut her off, his anger bubbling to the surface. "A mistake? You call lying to me and dragging our son into this a mistake? You've been having an emotional affair for months, and Jake's been lying to cover for you. How am I supposed to just accept that?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes again, and she looked down at her hands. I know I hurt you both, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I never meant for it to go this far." Ryan scoffed. "How far did it go, Sarah? How am I supposed to believe it wasn't physical?" Her face flushed with shame. "It wasn't," she whispered. "It never got that far. We talked, we met a few times, but I ended it before it went any further. That's the truth." Ryan wanted to believe her, but his trust was shattered. "Do you know how hard it is for me to believe anything you say right now? You've been lying to me for months." "I know," she admitted. "I wouldn't believe me either if I were you. But I swear, Ryan, I'm telling you the truth now. I ended things with Alex before it crossed that line." Ryan shook his head, the anger simmering just below the surface. "And Jake? Why did you let him get involved in this?" Sarah's lip quivered. "He found out by accident, Ryan. He saw one of the messages on my phone, and I didn't know how to handle it. I panicked. I told him not to say anything because I didn't want him to hate me. I didn't want you to hate me either." Ryan stood abruptly, unable to sit any longer. He paced the kitchen, running his hands through his hair. "So you thought the best solution was to let our son carry this secret? To make him lie for you?" Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now. "I know it was wrong. I never should have put him in that position, and I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, Ryan. I'll go to counseling. I'll talk to Jake. Anything. Just don't give up on us." Ryan stopped pacing, leaning against the counter as he stared at the floor. "I don't know what to do, Sarah. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. And I don't know how Jake will ever forgive you. Or me." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Sarah wiped her tears, her voice small and pleading. "Please, Ryan, don't make any decisions right now. Let's at least try to fix this." But Ryan wasn't sure if there was anything left to fix. He felt like his entire life had been turned upside down, and he didn't know where to go from here. "I need some time," he finally said, his voice hollow. "I need to think." With that, he left the kitchen and headed outside, desperate for some air, some space to clear his head. As he stood on the porch, staring out at their quiet neighborhood, Ryan's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. Sarah had hurt him deeply, but she was also the mother of his child, the woman he had built a life with. He didn't know if he could walk away from that. But the betrayal, the lies. How could he ever look at her the same way again? And then there was Jake. Ryan's heart broke for his son, who had been forced into a situation no child should ever face. He knew he needed to talk to Jake, to make sure the boy understood that none of this was his fault. But how could he explain everything when he barely understood it himself? Hours passed as Ryan stood on that porch, lost in thought. When Jake finally came home from school, Ryan met him in the living room. The boy looked exhausted, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "Dad," Jake said quietly, his voice breaking. Ryan felt a lump rise in his throat as he sat down on the couch, gesturing for Jake to sit next to him. "Come here, son." Jake hesitated for a moment before sitting down, looking nervously at his father. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want to lie to you, but Mom." Ryan cut him off, pulling Jake into a hug. "It's not your fault, Jake. I'm not mad at you." Jake buried his face in his father's shoulder, his small frame trembling with sobs. I didn't know what to do. I thought I was helping her. Ryan held his son tightly, feeling his heart break all over again. I know, Jake. I know you were trying to do the right thing, but you don't have to carry that secret anymore. None of this is your fault. They sat there for a long time, father and son, holding on to each other as the weight of the past few weeks finally began to lift. Ryan didn't have all the answers yet, and he didn't know what the future would hold for his family. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. He would protect Jake, no matter what. The tension in the Summers household didn't disappear after that moment in the living room, but a new sense of clarity began to emerge. Ryan knew that, for Jake's sake, they had to confront this mess head-on. But as the days passed, the weight of what had happened between him and Sarah still hung heavily in the air. Ryan couldn't escape the whirlwind of thoughts that consumed him. Every glance at Sarah reminded him of the lies, the deceit, and the man he didn't know, the one she had confided in instead of him. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed peace. For himself, for Jake. A few days after his conversation with Jake, Ryan sat Sarah down again, determined to get to the heart of it. They hadn't spoken much since the confrontation, the silence between them now filled with a heavy awkwardness. They sat in the living room, both of them unsure of where to start. Sarah was the first to break the silence. Ryan, she began softly, I don't know how to fix this. I've thought about it over and over, and I don't even know where to begin. Ryan stared at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. I don't either, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But we can't keep living like this. The lies, the secrets, it's tearing us apart. Sarah nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I hate that I involved Jake in this. I hate what I've done. But please, Ryan, I need you to understand that I never stopped loving you. Ryan's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment, the raw emotion between them was palpable. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that her feelings for him hadn't completely eroded, but trust was not something that could be so easily restored. You say you never stopped loving me, Ryan said, his voice strained. But how am I supposed to believe that when you turned to someone else? You told me you didn't cross that physical line, but how can I be sure? You lied about everything else. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. I get why you don't believe me. I get that. But I swear, Ryan, it wasn't physical. It could have been, and maybe it would have been if I hadn't ended it. But I stopped it before it went that far. Ryan leaned back on the couch, exhaling a long, tired breath. Why? Why did you even let it start? She wiped at her tears, frustration bubbling to the surface. I was lonely. You were always working, and when you were home, it felt like we were just going through the motions. I didn't feel like you even saw me anymore. Ryan felt a stab of guilt, but it was mixed with his anger. So, what? You decided to find someone else who would make you feel special? No, Sarah said quickly. I didn't go looking for it. It just happened. I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth. Alex made me feel heard, and I got caught up in that. But it wasn't love, Ryan. It wasn't even real. It was a distraction from everything I was feeling. Ryan stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he had trusted for so many years. And now? And now, Sarah whispered, I want to fix this. I want us to fix this. I don't want to lose you, Ryan. I know it'll take time, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. Ryan didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. Part of him wanted to believe that they could come back from this, that their marriage could be salvaged. But the other part, the part that was still reeling from the betrayal, wasn't so sure. I need time, he finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. I don't know if I can just forgive and forget, Sarah. What you did, what you both did, it's not something that's going to heal overnight. Sarah nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I understand. For a while, they sat in silence, the weight of everything hanging over them. Ryan knew that no matter what happened next, things between them would never be the same. But whether that meant the end of their marriage or the beginning of something new, he wasn't sure. The next few weeks were difficult. Ryan had told Sarah he needed space, but it was impossible to find when they lived under the same roof. He took to sleeping in the guest room, avoiding her as much as he could, but the physical distance only seemed to highlight the emotional chasm between them. Jake, meanwhile, seemed caught between his parents. He knew something had changed, but he didn't fully understand the extent of it. He tried to act like everything was normal, but Ryan could see the fear and confusion in his eyes. Ryan couldn't let that go on. He needed to have a real conversation with his son. One night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Ryan knocked on Jake's door. "Hey, buddy," he said, poking his head in. "Can I come in?" Jake, who was lying on his bed with his headphones on, quickly sat up. "Yeah, sure." Ryan stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Ryan wasn't sure how to begin. He had never been good at these kinds of talks. "How are you doing?" Ryan finally asked. Jake shrugged. "Okay, I guess." Ryan sighed. "Listen, Jake, I know things have been hard lately. I know you've been caught in the middle of all this, and I'm really sorry about that." Jake looked down at his hands. "It's not your fault, Dad." Ryan shook his head. "It's not yours either. You shouldn't have had to lie for your mom. You shouldn't have had to carry that secret." "I didn't know what else to do," Jake admitted, his voice small. "She said it would ruin everything if I told you." Ryan's heart broke for his son. "I know, and that wasn't fair to you. But Jake, you don't ever have to lie for us. Not for me, not for your mom. You can always come to me with anything, no matter what." Jake nodded, but his eyes were filled with worry. "Are you and Mom gonna get divorced?" The question hung in the air, and Ryan felt the full weight of it settle on his shoulders. He had been asking himself that same question every day since he found out about Sarah's betrayal, but he still didn't have an answer. "I don't know," Ryan said honestly. "We're still trying to figure things out." Jake's face fell, and Ryan felt the sting of guilt once more. He had always prided himself on being a good father, on keeping their family together, but now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. "We're going to try," Ryan said, trying to reassure his son. "I can't promise what's going to happen, but we're going to try." Jake didn't say anything, but he leaned into his father, and Ryan wrapped an arm around him, holding him close. As the days turned into weeks, Ryan tried to take things one step at a time. He and Sarah were in an odd limbo, neither together nor fully apart. She had started seeing a counselor on her own, and they had agreed to try couples therapy, but Ryan still wasn't sure what the future held for them. It was during one of these sessions that the truth finally came to light. They were sitting in the therapist's office, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, had been guiding them through an exercise on communication when Sarah suddenly broke down. "There's something I need to tell you," she sobbed, her hands trembling. "Something I haven't told you yet." Ryan's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Sarah wiped her eyes, her voice shaking. "It was physical, Ryan. I didn't want to admit it before, but it was. I slept with him." Ryan felt the world shift beneath his feet. He had suspected it all along, but hearing it out loud was like being punched in the gut. "How many times?" he asked, his voice cold. "Twice," she whispered. "It only happened twice, and then I ended it." Ryan stood up abruptly, unable to sit any longer. The therapist said something, but he didn't hear her. All he could hear was the sound of his heart shattering into a million pieces. The betrayal was complete. Ryan stormed out of the therapist's office, leaving Sarah sitting there, sobbing. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay there. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to be far away from her. As he drove aimlessly through the streets, Ryan's mind raced. Everything Sarah had said, every promise she had made, it was all a lie. She had cheated, and she had dragged their son into it. There was no coming back from this. Ryan drove for what felt like hours, letting the endless stretch of road and the hum of the engine drown out the roar of thoughts in his mind. Everything had unraveled so quickly. Sarah's betrayal was more than he could bear, but what stung even more was the lie, the one that Jake had been pulled into. His son had been complicit, albeit unwillingly, in his mother's deception. Finally, he pulled into the parking lot of a small park, the same park where he had taken Jake when he was younger. The swings swayed gently in the wind, and the sight brought back memories of a simpler time, before lies, before betrayal. Ryan sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing through the events of the last few weeks. How had it come to this? How had his family, the one thing he had always cherished, crumbled before his eyes? His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Jake. Jake, Dad, are you okay? Mom's really upset. Can you come home? Ryan stared at the message, his heart heavy with the weight of it all. Jake had been stuck in the middle of this disaster, and no matter how much Ryan wanted to lash out, he knew that his son didn't deserve to be collateral damage. With a deep sigh, Ryan texted back, "Ryan, I'll be home soon. We'll talk." The drive home was slower this time. Ryan didn't know what he was going to say, or even what he was feeling anymore. The anger that had consumed him when he stormed out of the therapist's office had begun to fade, leaving behind only exhaustion and an aching emptiness. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for a light in the living room. Ryan sat in the car for a moment, staring at the familiar facade of the place he had called home for over a decade. Could it still be home after everything that had happened? Inside, he found Jake waiting on the couch, nervously fiddling with the hem of his shirt. Sarah wasn't in sight, but he could hear the faint sound of her crying upstairs. Ryan wasn't ready to face her yet. "Hey, bud," Ryan said quietly as he sat down next to Jake. Jake looked up, his face full of concern. "Are you okay, Dad?" Mom said. Ryan cut him off gently. "I know what she said, Jake. And no, I'm not okay. But that's not your fault." Jake's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to lie to you. I didn't know what else to do." Ryan pulled his son into a hug, holding him tightly. "I know, Jake. You don't have to apologize for any of this. What happened between your mom and me, that's between us. You shouldn't have been involved." Jake pulled away slightly, wiping his eyes. "But I wasn't I? I should have told you, but I didn't want to hurt you. I thought if I just kept quiet, everything would go back to normal." Ryan's heart broke hearing his son's words. "I understand why you did it. But Jake, no matter what happens between your mom and me, you don't have to lie for us. Not ever." Jake nodded, though he still looked unsure. Are you guys going to get divorced?" Ryan had been dreading that question. He had no clear answer, but he owed his son the truth. "I don't know, Jake. I don't know what's going to happen. But what I do know is that I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Jake didn't say anything, but the relief in his eyes was clear. He leaned against his father, and for a moment, they just sat there in silence, the weight of the world pressing down on them both. The next few days passed in a blur. Ryan and Sarah barely spoke, though they remained civil for Jake's sake. Ryan spent most of his time at work, throwing himself into projects in an attempt to distract himself from the turmoil at home. But no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, the question of what to do next loomed over him like a dark cloud. It was during one of these long, solitary evenings that Ryan got a call he didn't expect. It was from Alex. The name on the screen sent a jolt of anger through him, but curiosity and a need for closure got the better of him. He answered, "What do you want?" Ryan's voice was cold, sharper than he intended. There was a long pause on the other end before Alex finally spoke, his voice soft and hesitant. "Ryan, I'm sorry. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to apologize for everything." Ryan didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what Alex could possibly say to make things better. "I never meant to cause this," Alex continued, his voice full of guilt. "What happened between Sarah and me, it was a mistake. A huge mistake. I never should have let it happen, and I've regretted it every day since." Ryan clenched his jaw, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You regret it now? After you've ruined my family?" "I know nothing I say can fix it," Alex said quietly, "but I want you to know that it wasn't about you. It wasn't even about Sarah, really. We both just made bad choices. But it's over. It's been over for a while." Ryan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Alex's words settle over him. He wanted to scream, to yell, to lash out at this man who had stolen a piece of his life. But what good would it do? "What do you expect me to do with this, Alex?" Ryan asked bitterly. "I don't expect anything. Alex replied. I wanted to say I'm sorry, and that I won't ever come between you two again. I'm leaving town. I'm getting out of here, for good. Ryan exhaled slowly. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know, Alex said. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you can find some peace. Ryan didn't respond. He simply ended the call, staring at the phone in his hand. Peace. It was a word that felt foreign to him now, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, Ryan sat down with Sarah for what he hoped would be the last of these difficult conversations. He was tired of the lies, tired of the pain, tired of the endless cycle of betrayal. We can't keep doing this, he said, his voice steady but weary. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. I know. I spoke to Alex, Ryan continued. He's leaving. He's gone. Sarah didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded, her expression hollow. I'm sorry, Ryan. For everything. Ryan rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the weight of the last few months crushing him. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what you did, but I can't keep holding on to all this anger either. It's tearing me apart. Sarah swallowed hard, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I love you, Ryan, and I want to fix this, if you'll let me. Ryan looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, but also something else. Remorse, maybe even hope. I don't know what the future looks like for us, Ryan said quietly, but I do know that Jake deserves better than this. If we're going to fix anything, we need to start there. We need to be good parents to him. Sarah nodded, wiping her tears. You're right. Jake deserves better. They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them staring at the floor, unsure of what to do next. Finally, Ryan stood up. I'm not ready to forgive you, Sarah, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. But I'm willing to try. For Jake. For us. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and relief. Thank you, she whispered. Ryan didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there in the silence. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and it wasn't the end of their struggles, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.